Ever feel like those political labels we see all the time, they don't really tell the whole story? Like, are you really just somewhere on that line between left and right?
Yeah.
Today, we're going deeper into your crash course lecture on political ideologies, and we're going to add some dimensions to it. Economic, cultural, and political are all playing a role here.
Right.
It's like trying to figure out your political location on a map, but instead of just north or south, we've got east, west, up, down.
Exactly. It's a really fascinating mix of all these different factors. For example, you could have someone who's very economically liberal, free markets, limited government, all that. But then on cultural issues, maybe they're more conservative.
Interesting.
Maybe they have more traditional views on things like family.
Right?
So this multidimensional model really helps us see how someone can have these seemingly different viewpoints,
Uh-huh.
but they can all exist together within their own personal ideology.
It's like they're a free market fiscal conservative,
Right.
but also volunteers at the local soup kitchen.
Exactly.
So it's not really a contradiction.
Yeah,
It's just a more well-rounded picture of how their beliefs all come together.
precisely. And that's where this idea of thick versus thin ideologies comes in. Those big ideologies, the kind of overarching ones like liberalism or socialism, those are your thick ideologies. Think of them like a full-course meal.
Okay.
They're trying to address all these different issues and kind of paint this complete picture of what society should look like.
Thin ideologies are more like side dishes.
Yeah, exactly. They're more focused on a specific issue or maybe a set of issues that are related, like environmentalism or animal rights. They add a lot of flavor and complexity, but they don't necessarily dictate your entire worldview.
You can be fiscally conservative, but also be very passionate about the environment.
Absolutely. And that's what's so great about thinking about it this way. It allows for so much variation and complexity and acknowledges that people don't fit neatly into these little boxes.
It's like instead of going to a buffet and having to choose just one cuisine, we can have a little bit of everything.
Exactly. I like that analogy.
Yeah.
One of the things I found most interesting in the lecture was how much our emotions play a part in our political ideologies.
Oh, absolutely.
Like we want to think that we're making these rational decisions based on logic.
Mm-hmm.
But let's be real. Emotions are often in the driver's seat.
It's true, emotions can be powerful, and the lecture even gave that really chilling example of the Rwandan genocide
Yeah.
and how two groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, basically had totally different realities in their minds.
Right.
And it was all based on these deep prejudices and fears.
That's a powerful example of how our emotions, even our prejudices, can shape how we see the world, and they can have devastating consequences.
Really makes you think about how ideology isn't always about being right or wrong, or even having all the facts. Sometimes it's just about how we feel deep down.
Right. And what I thought was fascinating was this idea that even small preferences or instincts can tell us a lot about our values and maybe even our political leanings. So the lecture mentioned how even something as simple as how someone prefers to raise their children
Okay.
can be predictive of their political views.
Like what?
Do they want their children to be considerate or well-behaved?
I'm picturing myself answering that question right now, and I'm curious which way I lean.
It's these little connections that I find so fascinating.
Yeah.
Like these tiny little details can actually give us these insights into our deeper values and how they shape our political outlook.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much of our political identity is even a choice, right? Which kind of leads us to that age-old debate, nature versus nurture.
Are we born with these beliefs, or is it the environment we're raised in?
Are we hardwired for this stuff, or is it all learned?
Yeah, it's a question that's been around forever, and this lecture did a great job of talking about both sides.
Mm-hmm.
On the nature side, you've got those fascinating twin studies.
Yeah.
Take identical twins,
Yeah.
separate them at birth, raise them in totally different environments.
Right.
And they still often end up with these really similar political views.
The lecture mentioned that studies have shown ideology could be like a third to a half heritable, which is a lot. That's a big chunk of our political DNA.
It's pretty compelling evidence for sure. So his research found that liberals and conservatives actually tend to value different things. It's almost like they're speaking different moral languages.
You know, I've always thought that was so interesting. It's
Yeah.
like liberals, they tend to value things like care and fairness, but conservatives are more about loyalty and authority and tradition.
Exactly. And because they're starting from these different moral foundations, it can be tough
Yeah,
to find that common ground.
totally. It's like
Yeah.
if you're coming at it from these two totally different, like you're speaking two different languages.
There's tons of research on how our upbringing, our social groups, even just the media we consume, all of that can really shape our political outlook.
It makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
It's like our families, our friends, the communities we grow up in.
Yeah?
It's a constant stream of information that's shaping how we see the world.
Yeah, the stories we hear, the conversations we have or don't have, it all matters.
So where does that leave us? Are we just destined to be products of our genes and our upbringing? Are we forever stuck in this nature versus nurture battle? Feels like a chicken and egg thing, right? And this reminds me of that other point from the lecture, that our personalities might actually be connected to our political leanings.
Oh, interesting.
Like, who knew if you like change or you need order?
Right.
It could be tied to your politics.
The lecture talked about some research suggesting that people who are okay with change
Yeah.
and uncertainty tend to be more liberal. And then people who want more structure and predictability often lean more conservative.
The house makes you think about those things we might not even realize are affecting our views. And it comes back to that nature versus nurture debate.
Are we born with these personality traits?
Are they just because of how we were raised?
Right.
Or is it this big mix of both?
It's like that saying, we are our choices.
Yeah.
Our choices are shaped by.
Right.
It just goes on and on.
It's never simple.
Right.
And that's what I liked about the lecture.
It makes us think outside those labels and boxes.
It's not just nature versus nurture. It's both. And it's not just left versus right.
Exactly.
It's way more complicated than that.
It's this whole spectrum.
Yes. We're finally realizing that people are complex.
Yes.
There's so much that goes into how we form our beliefs.
Absolutely.
And speaking of complex, remember that example about Wimbledon?
What about it?
Who knew that something like a dress code could be linked to political ideology?
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows how deep this stuff goes. That our values can even affect things like what we think people should wear to play tennis.
Yeah. The lecture mentioned some studies that showed there was a correlation between opinions on the dress code and views on immigration. It's like these underlying beliefs about tradition and rules and even just self-expression. They actually end up shaping how we see a lot of different issues.
It's all connected.
It really is mind-blowing. It's like this web of connections between our values and our personality and what we experience in life. It even affects what we think about tennis clothes.
Exactly.
So it's like political ideologies aren't just these abstract concepts that we argue about online.
Right.
They're really connected to who we are.
Right. How we see the world.
And how we live our lives.
Exactly.
This has been really interesting. We've gone way beyond those basic political labels and really dug into the psychology and the sociology of how we form our beliefs.
That's complicated stuff.
So, as we finish up, is there one big question that you hope our listeners will keep thinking about?
I think the lecture leaves us with a really important question. If our political ideologies are shaped by all these different things, our biology, our upbringing, our values, even our personalities, does that mean we can actually change our minds about this stuff?
Oh, that's a good question.
Are we stuck with these beliefs forever?
That is a big question.
It is.
When everything feels so divided.
Yeah, and if we can change our minds, how do we even begin to have productive conversations?
Right.
To try to bridge these divides?
It's a tough one.
It takes a lot of empathy and listening and being open to different viewpoints.
And remembering that everyone has their own story. And that's how they form their beliefs.
Everyone's political journey is different.
It's a reminder that there is a human being behind every political stance.
Listening to those stories is so important.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to think about all of this. This has been a fascinating deep dive
It has.
into the world of political ideologies.
Definitely.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive on a new topic.